Hello and welcome everybody to this beekeeping chat with the bee whisperer Peter Cowin and Amy Nickerson. Peter has been a commercial beekeeper for decades in Maine and produces thousands of pounds of honey while producing hundreds of nucs each year. He has a YouTube channel helping teach beekeepers. It's called Beekeeping with the Bee Whisperer, right? I think that's
Yep,
what it is.
that's right.
His business partner, Amy, has kept bees for over 10 years now and was originally mentored by Peter. Together, they started Beekeeping 24/7 in 2022, a group that helps struggling beekeepers throughout the US and some in Canada too, from what they tell me. We will discuss honey production, mite management, equalization, splitting, and feeding. Without further ado, will you please give us a brief background on your beekeeping history?
Sure, I'll start. I have been keeping bees since I was 11, so back in the early 70s. And so, yeah, I know it's old. That's old. Yeah, I know.
I started when I was 12.
Right. Well, and sort of started with my first hive over ordered through the Sears Roebuck catalog, and a friend had given us some old beekeeping equipment. And beekeeping back then was really easy because you read a few books, you knew what to do, had a good idea how to start. And as a teenager, I never lost a hive. It was you gave them lots of room in the spring, harvested lots of honey in the fall, and bees made it through the winters all the time. Unless you were unfortunate in some areas. I mean, we had things. If you'd been in Maine, you might have had a lot of American foul brood at that time. But I never experienced that. So it was very, very different. I spent 30 years overseas and came back, and beekeeping had changed enormously in New England. I grew up in Massachusetts, but here in Maine, we now had the Varroa mite to deal with. And so that totally changed it. So it was like learning beekeeping all over again. Because while the bees are pretty good at looking after themselves, without help of the beekeeper now, with the mites, it had it. So I've stayed as a hobbyist beekeeper until maybe 15 years ago or so, when it started to really scale up. I was asked by local education authorities to do beekeeping classes, and did a lot of swarm removals and colony removals from buildings and stuff. And I built up my apiary from half a dozen hives to 20 to 30 hives. And I teamed up with who was my mentor in Maine, Harold Swan. And he's the guy who started with his father Swan's Honey back in the 1940s. So you can't have bought a jar of honey in Maine without coming across the name Swan. And Harold was sort of the grandfather of beekeeping here in Maine. And he was a great asset to us locally. But Harold was getting on in years, and he didn't have the energy anymore to do the beekeeping supply store. So I started doing beekeeping supplies. And for many years, I was helping him handle with the packages of bees and nucs and that sort of thing, until I took that over as well. So that really, the variety of starting to do things like supplying some of the nucs, handling all these bees, it really started to develop my beekeeping, that and teaching as well. Because when you start to take the responsibility to teach somebody else beekeeping, you suddenly realize all the things you've been doing wrong for decades. And so that's how I met Amy, as one of my early beekeeping classes. And since then, I've been growing my beekeeping. I typically, right now, I've got about 200 and something hives scattered around 8 different yards. I'll typically go through the winter with about 100, somewhere between 100 and 150 colonies. And I make most of my living making nucs, selling nucs with Saskatraz queens, Italian queens. I'm actually trying out this year some of Randy Oliver's Golden West queen as well, which is really cool. During the pandemic, I couldn't do the beekeeping classes anymore. So my younger son taught me how to do YouTube videos. And so, like, you got into YouTubing. And so with that channel, that's grown way more than I ever imagined. And I think partially with that and partially with the classes and things, Amy came to me with the idea of a different way of approaching teaching beekeeping. And so that was really cool, but I'll let Amy tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm Amy Nickerson, and I've been keeping bees for a little over 10 years. I had a very high stress job and I needed a hobby. And I saw one of Peter's commercials and I'm like, oh, I'll try that, even though I was absolutely terrified of bees. I don't know what made me choose that, but I did take the class and was immediately hooked. Immediately. I'm a hobbyist beekeeper, so I keep bees. I live right in Bangor. I live in the city. I've got them in my backyard. I also have another apiary that's a little bit more rural, so I kind of have both. So I keep anywhere from 5 to 10 to 12 hives at a time. And I've been obsessed with it ever since. And Peter was my mentor. He taught me. I took classes from him. And what I remember so much from being a new beekeeper is I took his classes and I took notes and I got my bees and immediately forgot everything that I learned and killed them first year. I mean, so I got no more bees and killed them the next year because you panic because you tend to forget everything. So what we came up with, like Peter said, during the pandemic was a new way to teach people. And, during the pandemic, everybody was on YouTube and Facebook, and because we were all, pretty much being kept together, away from each other. And what we did was, we were seeing a lot of negativity, especially with the new beekeepers that were asking questions. Other people would say, take a class, or you should have known this before you came in here. And it was really unsettling to both of us. And so what we did is we came up with Beekeeping 24/7, and it's an online education and mentoring program. And our business motto is beekeeping with respect and kindness. And we've managed to put together an amazing group of people that have joined us from all over the U.S. And believe it or not, there is zero negativity in this group. There are no stupid questions. We welcome any kind of question that anybody might have.
And that both of us are past presidents of the local beekeeping association, Penobscot County. I'm the founder of Penobscot County Beekeepers, and it's the local groups are the ideal way to have a mentor and that sort of thing. But a lot of folks don't have access to that, or are not comfortable in those environments. And whilst they're really good sources of information, what we do is we provide an alternative way of learning about it in the comfort of your own home and the privacy of your own home.
Yeah. And people can take the class, like Peter said, at their own speed. We offer a complete beginner beekeeping course. It's about 12 one-hour videos. You can watch it. You can go back. You can watch it again. It's always there. You can refer to sections as you need to. We also have over 80 instructional videos where we show different methods and mite control and splits and you name it, we do it.
Wow. So we were talking before on here, you said, I think the most important part of it for a lot of beekeepers is that you get instant feedback. So somebody can see something in their hive, and instead of just trying to read back through 40 pages of notes, they can go to you, ask the question, get some experienced beekeepers' opinions on what's going on. And so I think that has a lot of value, because I definitely remember that. I'd go out to my hive my first year, and it was early August, and I see a bunch of queen cups. And luckily I have a mentor. So I sent her the pictures and she's like, that's nothing to worry about. Those aren't even queen cells. You're fine. Everything's fine. But that kind of feedback, like, I don't know what I would have done otherwise. I would have been certainly worried. I would have probably acted differently, but that instant feedback is really helpful. And so can you kind of talk further to that?
Sure. And also it's quite useful, because when we do get the questions like that, Amy and I, the next day we're together, we'll usually make a video associated with that specific topic and any other interesting questions that have popped up in the last few days. So we might make off the cuff immediate videos in response and elaborate on what we can type on a message in response to a question. And so I think they find our members find that a real help, because as well as getting instant guidance right there and then, we're sort of holding their hand through the process of the beekeeping. We also then dive into it a little bit more in depth, so there's something to refer back to, as well as just the statement that we'll send them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there was a comment I saw over here. Beekeeping is the only thing I've ever done that I truly love. Love your videos. I'm not sure whose videos that's in reference to, but I also really enjoy your videos. I think I found your channel probably back in 2020 or 2021. One of my friends sent me a message. You heard of this guy, the Bee Whisperer? I was like, I don't know if I have, but I, have been watching your videos ever since.
Yeah, no, the thing is we have a lot of fun with what we do. And again, if you search YouTube or anywhere on the internet, it's like you ask one question, you're going to get 5, 10, 12 different answers from different methods. And what we do is we just teach the beekeeping that is successful for us, and it's been successful for us. We're not saying that it's the only way to keep bees, but this is how we keep bees and how it's been successful for us. So we kind of keep people like, sticking with one method.
Yeah, keeping it simple is really important. We try to touch on different ways you can vary it a bit, but we try to narrow down the field, sort of like you would typically do in a beginner's course.
Right.
But what we do then is elaborate on it. Say, for those who want to go a bit more in depth than this, here's something where you can try this, and you can do some splits, and as opposed to just the basics, keep them alive, keep them productive, keep them healthy. That's the main core of it. But then we go into more depth. So we've got some folks who've been with us now for this their third season. They're going into it, and so we need to keep them engaged as well. And so go into things like Tamari methods and making nukes or grafting queens and things. We'll do a little bit of that sort of thing this year.
Right.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense because you get, like you said, there's a million different opinions, and on the internet in general, and then you hone into beekeeping and you're at like 50 million different opinions. And so like honing what your precision, what you need to focus on, and that way they can branch out once they gain that experience. I see how valuable that could be.
Yeah. And with those 50 different answers that you might get, 45 of them are well-intentioned.
Yeah.
But maybe 10 of them were just what that person needed to know because it was on the right tack. The problem for the beginner going on to a group like that, where it's a lot of different inputs, is that they may follow one set of good advice this week, and they ask another question, they start getting veered off into a tangent from another set of good advice on that week. And so the continuity is really, really important. The other 5 out of the 50 are comments that really should never have been published, and and somebody should have taken them down because they're really unnecessarily critical and hurtful for a beginner who genuinely is asking for information, doesn't know what they don't know. And so I think some people need to experience a little bit more patience and try and remember how hard it was when they first started.
Yeah, I mean, they chose to join the group, it's like
yeah, that's right.
Right. What's neat to see too is like Peter said, we've had people that have been with us since day one, our charter members, and to see where they've come now, and they're actually, so we're always bringing in new members, and they are actually helping some of the newest members, and to see them saying that, teaching and giving advice that we gave them, it's just, that's exactly what we were looking for. That's what we were hoping for. So let's develop this group of kind and respectful people, because we all love beekeeping. There's no reason for it ever to be negative.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just the most addictive thing I've ever, experienced. It's just,
it is.
And it's a real Zen experience when we get nice weather and you're not sweating in your bee suit, but you're just comfortable in your bee suit. It's a nice breeze going through your ventilated suits or something. And the bees are, especially these couple of weeks of the year, beginning of June till till summer solstice, it's unbelievable how fast the bees will grow, how productive they can be, how energetic they can be, and how calm and gentle they can be. Even the relatively temperamental hives are usually in a great mood at this time of year. And it's on the few occasions where I didn't have bees, it was something that you desperately miss. Once you're hooked, you desperately miss it. On a warm spring day, it's horrible not having bees.
It is.
Yeah, there's just nothing like beekeeping on honey flow. It's just the bees are happy, you're happy. It's just the perfect time of year.
The sounds and the smells, and it's just
My mom is like, I don't really like June, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I love June.
Even with the black flies getting through your veil and the ticks crawling all over you and that sort of thing, it's still great.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure. So speaking of like how the bees grow this year, how are you making your nukes and your splits this time of year in the spring?
Right. It varies a little bit as the temperatures change. Right now, you could make a nuke out of virtually a single frame of bees, but typically what I'll do is I will take a couple of frames, because what I typically do is I'll start with bees of all sorts of origins, whether they were Italians or Saskatraz or whatever. I'll split the hive down and take 2 good frames of brood, a good frame of resources, and another frame of bees, shake it in. And so I'll put them into a nuke box, and then I'll introduce mated queens. And so I get my Saskatraz queens from Oliveira's honeybees in California, and I'll get in hundreds of queens, dozens or hundreds every week. And then I sort of take the risk of getting those queens accepted. And so after a week to 2 weeks, I'll be going through and checking that the queen's been accepted. There's no queen cells in there, and then follow it through until I've got a nuke ready for sale, which will be, say, three plus frames of brood and 2 good frames of resources and a little bit of space. And it's kind of it's always a balancing act, because you're trying to say, okay, I've got 8 ready right now. I can phone up 8 people. Some of them will be able to take them now, and some will not be able to take them till next week. So I've got to phone up somebody else to take it this week and put another one, the one for next week, is a different group of bees, because it's always a just-in-time thing. You've got a window of opportunity where that nuke is just right for about a week before it's before that it's not big enough for you to feel confident saying, here's your nuke, I'm so proud of this. And if you wait a week too late, you've got a nuke that's got queen cells developing in it, and it's all bursting at the seams, and the person's going to have a swarm. So it's a bit of an art, and it's amazing how much you learn by making nukes, as you'll appreciate. I learned more when I started making nukes in 5 years than I did in the previous 50. Because you learn so, especially when you're doing a lot of them, because you see so many different changes in different conditions. So that same nuke that I might have made with 2 frames of bees right now, I don't need to have 2 full frames of bees in the beginning of June to make a good nuke. 2 half frames, one with young brood, one with more cat brood. That's going to be great in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, ready to sell. Back in beginning of May, I'd have had to make sure there's a lot of extra bees in there to keep that brood warm. Right now, you virtually can have a bee per square inch, and you virtually got them warm enough to keep that brood warm. Whereas if it's cold weather, then that's not gonna fly. Then also you need to be feeding them right and that sort of thing. Make sure they've got the resources. So in early May, you have to be feeding them, whereas right now you could get away without feeding them because there's so much food coming in, pollen substitutes, that sort of thing. So that's typically how I'd make my nukes anyway. Later in the year, of course, that'll be a bit different. If I'm making nukes for overwintering, growth starts slowing down a lot. They're more concerned about storing food and things. So a nuke that I start off with 2 frames now would be 15 frames of brood in about a month and a bit. Whereas if I do that same thing in beginning of July, it'll be 3 frames of brood a month later, and lots of honey and stuff, but it won't get to the same sort of proportions, and it's much more vulnerable to things going wrong, getting robbed, or even things like small hive beetles and stuff could be an issue with a small colony later on in the season.
Yeah, what do you find, like, what's like your acceptance percentages on those queens? I'm curious.
On those queens, again, that varies a lot as well. And sometimes it varies with the yard that I made the bees from. I haven't quite got my finger on that exactly why. But I would say on average, it's about 85% success. maybe 90%. And then some days I'll have done 24 and I get 22, 23 good nukes after 2 or 3 weeks. And in some I've got 15 out of 24.
Yeah.
So I might get a 60% in the occasional yard, but I'll get lots of 85s and 90% as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to budget that into your purchase of queen. Just like buying, even though you're buying them by the 100, they're still not cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not cheap. No. And I was going to go, where was I going to go with that? Do you find like, so I'm assuming the ones that don't accept the queen, you just let them make their own, or like, what is your game plan on that?
It depends. If it's say a lot of the nukes I make are Saskatraz nukes, and if I've made them from Italians, I can't do that unless it was from. Generally I don't. It goes into a collective thing. Actually, those are the ones I often make my honey from, because what I will do is I'll have 25 nukes and 4 of them didn't take, and so I've now got 4 nukes with queen cells, and the others are gonna be sold. So I'll take those 4 nukes with queen cells, combine them, and I'll have 2 single deeps hives. I'll make two hives out of that. Let the queens fight it out, and let them get a brood nest going, and then I might requeen them with the queens that I want, or queens that I know what they are. And so very often that's how I make my honey. And so whereas you're right, I do typically make thousands of pounds of honey per year, I miss most of my opportunity for making honey. I should be making tens of thousands of pounds of honey with the amount of bees I've got.
Yeah.
But because all my hives right now, my average hive is probably 8 frames right now, as opposed to Amy's hives, which is she's got 6 deep supers stacked one on top of the other right now.
Yeah.
So Amy can make a lot of spring honey. I don't make any honey unless there's a fall flow, because most of, I've got maybe 10% of my hives are getting ready to produce honey. All the rest are about nuke size.
Yeah. It's all about what you're going for. I actually never heard of anyone else doing it that way, Peter, using the queens that didn't, or using the hives that didn't accept their queens to, as their honey production colony. That's really interesting. I did the same thing. I took advantage of the, you don't need that many bees this time of year to make splits last week when I split everything. But it's just interesting because, like we just discussed, there's a million different methods. And so there's many different ways to tackle it.
Yeah. And it's a matter of how adapting the management to suit what you're doing in particular. So there's a lot of niches and ways of making beekeeping work for you. And the trick is to find your own little niche.
Absolutely. So, since Amy's the honey production expert here, how do you maximize your honey production, Amy?
So, in the past, I've always done the 2 deeps, and then your honey supers, your mediums, or your shallows and stuff like that. Well, last year Peter and I started playing more and more with the Damari method, and last year I made a crazy amount of honey using the Damari method off 2 hives in my backyard, and right now I'm on point to make even more than that the spring. I mean, like Peter said, I've got 5 deep supers that are just getting filled up with honey right now using the single brood chamber.
So like a 7 tall hive?
No. Like I have 6. So I've got,
okay.
No, I've got 4. I've got 4 on right now. And then my 5th is my actual single brood on the bottom. Okay. So the single brood chamber, and then the queen excluder, and then I've used all deeps, which is amazing because they will fill it up with honey. But on the other hand, it's very heavy and I'm very short. So I'll have to figure out some get some ladders and stuff going to get this off. But I find that has just it makes a crazy amount of honey doing management that way. But you have to stay on top of it, because if you don't, they will swarm.
Yeah. So Amy got about 175 pounds per hive last year.
Yeah.
So that's quite something to be envious of. I mean, typically I might get every year I'll probably get a hive that'll do 200 plus pounds of honey, but more to consistently get it, then start learning more about the Damari method and the ways of getting a monster-sized hive without losing a swarm. That really is key. If you want to make honey, that's the way to do it. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, both in terms of going through queen cells and ticking off your bees, but also there's a lot of lifting involved as well, because your hives are getting pretty darn tall, and you're typically ending up with a deep supers up here that you're good for the upper body strength anyway.
If you have it.
You don't throw out your back while you do it, you know?
Yeah. I'm more worried about it falling down
I
on me.
was pointing out to Amy a little while ago, though, there's always the option of just taking it out frame by frame as opposed to lifting the whole 80-pound super.
You don't even think of that, though.
Yeah, that's like, right. So you can always do it. Take them apart before you lift them.
And then you got to remember too. You got to remember to bring these hives back down once you get closer into fall. You've got these monster hives, and now you got to start, backing it down towards fall, so they can start packing the honey in for themselves. So.
Well, I'm disappointed you only have 320 pounds of honey so far. I'm
so
really. You must be struggling.
I am. It's I'm disappointed.
Are you gonna have enough honey for the year, or
what?
Are you gonna have enough honey for the year? Yeah.
I don't know. It's gonna be tight.
It's amazing once you start having honey that you find all sorts of ways of getting rid of it.
You do.
Yeah. Indeed. Last year was a terrible honey year for me. Awful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the weather was crazy.
The weather was crazy, but as I say, in between the showers, it was unbelievable how much honey they brought in.
Yeah.
It really was something to watch.
Yeah, I felt really bad last year for the new beekeepers, because every hive just they were all inside, and they just swarmed and swarmed and swarmed, and hives that normally wouldn't swarm did, and so it was a tough year to start, but but for me it was the best honey production year I'd had so far.
Yeah, I don't think we get as good of a flow down here where I live compared to you guys. Maybe you guys just have better yards than I have found, but we just don't get the same kind of honey flow, it seems. I mean, we have, most of the time our honey flow cuts off by like the 7th or 10th of July, somewhere in there. And we only get like a few really good weeks of flow. But speaking to last year, in between the raindrops, I think it was like around the 1st of June, 3rd of June, something like that. It was like 60 degrees and the blackberries were blooming. And in between rain showers, I mean, more nectar than I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it was 60 degrees and it was a flow. Like, it was crazy.
Yeah. And so it can be really, really good like that. Also, you've probably not been around long enough to experience good fall honey flows, because at times you can get some really good fall honey flows. Some years it just doesn't happen at all.
Yeah.
Some years it's just about enough to avoid you having to feed to get the brood chamber ready for winter for a double deep or something.
Yeah.
And some years you're filling two medium supers a week. Yeah. It doesn't happen often, but I've seen it maybe twice in the last 20 years where they're filling it up and you're making 100 pounds every couple of weeks. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's been unfortunate for me as far as goldenrod goes. The earliest I've seen a flow was probably last year. Bees were starting to draw home on like the 23rd of August or something when Jen came down to my apiary. So I think that was like the earliest I've seen it. In my first year of beekeeping in 2018, that was the best year I've ever had fall flow wise. We got the bees filled up 2 deeps full of honey, so I didn't have to feed a drop. They wouldn't even take the syrup. They were so full.
Yeah. So you can imagine that. I think 2012, seemed to remember, was a really good year. But here it's just been that fall flow is just so fickle. As I say, some years there's not, you're having to feed from the middle of July, and yet other years you can get a spectacular flow. It doesn't seem. I mean, with the droughts, it's going to be a bad year, and it can be really, really patchy as well. Because I was having so fall honey flow, and the professor at the University of Maine, what's his name?
Phil?
No, the one before Phil. It's a great friend as well. Sorry, there's signs of age. Don't. I suppose it's the alternative, but this is what you got to look forward to. Anyway, so he was in Arno. They were filling a deep super a week with honey right until early October, throughout September. I mean, it was just amazing.
And it's amazing how it varies from location to location too. I find that my spring honey flows continue further because I'm in town. Everybody waters their garden, so the droughts aren't as extreme as they are in the more urban areas sometimes. So it tends to end a little bit sooner. But the ornamental gardens are a big help for in town and stuff like that. But I've got my urban hives are right in the middle of a goldenrod field, and yeah, it's hit or miss. It's hit or miss what the goldenrod's going to do.
Yeah, I found the biggest factor is I've had really good flows in drought years. 2020 was a really bad drought year, and I didn't have to feed really. For me, what my best guess to the most important factor is just the temperature. Warm. If you get the warm first 2 weeks of September, you get a lot of honey. If you don't, just pretty much nothing. That's what I found to be.
And if you get an early frost, you're done.
The temperature really does superimpose itself over all these flows. Because I mean, like the clover flow, you want that warm weather with moist ground. And if you get one of these upper level lows in the middle of June, or it goes down to 55 degrees for a week, the clover flow may have just started and then it just never comes back. And so I can distinctly remember some years like that where I think it was the end of June. There was it just killed the flow stone dead, and once it stops, it often doesn't come back. And so a cold spell or a warm spell or a dry spell, we're at the mercy of it. That's right.
We're farmers after all.
That's right. That's right.
We got Brian here. Hello, all. Just drop your names in the chat and where you're tuning in from tonight. I had a package colony with plenty of room swarm within 2 months of install. I was quite surprised.
Oh yeah, they can swarm within a month. Basically, if they don't have the room for the expansion, and also sometimes you do everything right and they still want to swarm anyway. But 2 months is about bang on the time when most beginners have their first swarm. And usually it's associated with, I wonder if he comments on this, the point at which you go from your double deep brood chamber and adding your honey super. And what took me years to work out, and I probably just needed to ask somebody, is that if you put a queen excluder onto your double deep and then put your honey super on with foundation on it, a week later you get your swarm. 2 weeks later you get a swarm. Not in every hive, but in many of them. Whereas if you'd done the same thing but put some drawn comb up there, you wouldn't have had a swarm. Or if you, instead of putting a queen excluder on, put your foundation straight on your brood chamber, let them start to build just like they did from the first to the second box. Let them start to build, then shake the queen down, put your queen excluder in, no swarm. And so I'd say that in my beekeeping supply store, I'd say 50% of the folks that have their first swarm, maybe 70%, it's at that point they've added their first honey super, but they added a queen excluder. So if you put the queen excluder on, but wait till the comb is starting to get drawn, it's a world of difference.
Yeah. Jen was talking about if somebody who was really like their bees are stubborn, really didn't want to go into the super and it was good flow. And she was like, you can put it in between the two deeps for a week. And then if they start it, pull it up, and then you could put an excluder on if they draw enough of it out. And so we're just discussing like how some hives really don't want to draw through that excluder. And especially if you're on a lighter flow, I think that makes it even more challenging for them to get through the excluder into that honey super.
Yeah, if it's a really strong flow, they'll fill every nook and cranny anyway and go through every crevice. But I think you're right. That will probably explain why it varies a bit from year to year.
Yep, for sure. Got a comment here. I caught my own swarm. They were a Russian package. I used 5 frames of drawn, and they filled out both boxes and swarmed in 6 to 7 weeks. Yeah. It sounds like you got some swarmy, but probably very prolific bees there.
Yeah. People need to remember sometimes that, a swarming hive is a sign of a big, healthy colony. So we try to manage to avoid the swarms so we can maybe make some honey. However, if they do swarm, you got a big, healthy colony.
Yeah. So. And the other thing is, if you go into your hive every week, and you're going to not be caught unaware, because if you go in every week, you've got time to do something, take action, because you'll see the signs of swarming about to happen. So And usually you don't need to go into the whole hive. Just going through the whole of the upper brood chamber is enough, or even 3 or 4 frames is usually enough. I rarely go into the bottom brood chamber in a hive unless I have to. If I found queen cells or something upstairs, then I'll do it. But if you're in your hive every week and watch for queen cells, then swarming shouldn't catch you by surprise, unless you just don't have time to go in there every week, which is a shame because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and even if you're feeling stressed for time, just even lifting the box to look for cells is a great way to use your time efficiently if you want to not do a full inspection or a few frame inspection. 99% or not 99, probably 90% of the time, if they're swarming, you'll see them on the bottom somewhere.
So you're right. You're probably going to see maybe 80% of those cells are going to be on that bottom bar of the upper brood chamber.
Yeah, for sure. They really like putting them there, the extra space. We got Mary here from Michigan. Location is definitely important. Yeah. What do you guys notice a large difference in between yard to yard on flows?
Yes. Yeah. I've got one yard, I call it my Western Hamden yard, which usually does fine in the spring. This time of year it does fine. It's great for growing up a colony, but I've yet to produce many supers of honey from it in the fall. It almost never gets a full honey flow. There's a lot of woods around it, a lot less open land, whereas I've got some in Winterport with a great big variety of diverse land around it that usually consistently produces something in the spring and in the fall. My backyard tends to produce both spring and fall to a degree, and in urban environments you see a big difference.
And they'll either be there can be times too in the fall that I'm getting a flow and he's not, or vice versa. I mean, it's weird. We're not that far from each. We're 6 miles from each other, or no, 8 miles from each other, yet he'll have a flow or I won't have a flow. It's like, what's going on?
And that professor's name was Frank Drummond.
Frank.
And Frank, as I say, Orono is only another 5 miles to the north, and they were having terrific honey flows, and we weren't getting anything down here. So my apologies, Frank, if you're watching.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've mentored someone. It's 10 minutes away. I'm not sure how many miles, probably around 4 or 5 miles. And every August, he starts pulling in the goldenrod honey like mad. It's just every year and into the fall, into September. And you go to my hives and they're all bone dry, and it pretty much every year. And so it's just that much of a difference. I have fields of goldenrod too. I don't know what it is. He doesn't live in an urban area. It's just as rural as I am. But
it could also be the variety of goldenrod, because there's many species of goldenrod. And for example, this when you see fields of goldenrod in the first couple of weeks of August, that almost never produces a honey flow. Sometimes it does, but it's a species that typically starts to bloom around the 15th or so of August. That's when the goldenrod honey flow would start, if it's going to start. And then the big flows come when the asters, which are usually in the same environment, do produce. I think maybe sometimes we assume it's goldenrod, but it's probably actually asters that are producing the bulk of it. And so it can be really different. Every field has got a different balance in there. So I think a lot of times we see goldenrod and we think it should be producing, but it gives us lots of pollen. We're blessed with enormous amounts of pollen in the fall, but sometimes precious little nectar.
For sure. Yeah. Where I live, the goldenrod starts blooming around the 4th of July, and then it stops in late September. So obviously you got so many different species in that period of time. And we do see, I don't know if the bees, they don't flock to it right away. It typically takes them till the dearth to start getting the goldenrod pollen. So, like mid-July, but we have so much pollen here. It's amazing. So only my second year here. So next year will be way better for honey production because of the drawn comb in my supers. How much of a difference did you guys see when you first originally got, lots of drawn supers?
Oh yeah, that's enormous. What's it, 7 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. So all of that in your second year can go into honey production. So that can be a lot of honey production. So I hate hearing about the folks scraping the comb off their foundation or something like that because they didn't know these things. Yes, that's a real asset, having that extra extra comb. Having said that, I've seen in a good year a hive that's been started even with a package, and it had to build the foundation in the 2 deep supers and the honey supers, and still got 100 pounds of honey.
Yeah.
So in a good year, you can still do pretty well, but we don't get
for
too
sure.
many of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a funny comment here. Hold the line. I'm a Nickerson from Michigan.
Oh, hey. Hey, guys.
Yeah. We got Thomas Robinson. Unpulled frames are negative space. Yeah. So you have a lot of comb, but have you tried checkerboarding back in foundation? And I'm assuming you see more swarms if you did that when splitting.
Checkerboarding. Are we talking about honey supers or brood chambers?
No, I mean like brood chambers. Like, let's say you make a split on a double deep and you add back 4 frames of undrawn comb. A lot of people will think, well, why did my bees swarm? I added them. They have new frames to work on, but they haven't drawn them yet.
Yeah, that it's true. Some hives will take to it. And I get it. I'll bet it depends on the flow of nectar at the time. But yes, I will typically checkerboard it, move the brood about, sometimes from downstairs to upstairs as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I was just looking at some hives yesterday that I was thinning out, and I was checkerboarding them, and sometimes it's surprising how long it takes them to draw if you're not actually feeding them. And a couple of them had queen cells in there, so yeah, they don't always do, even though logically I guess the bees don't read the same books we do, and so they have a mind of their own. If everything is, then that's one of the things that keeps us guessing all the time, because you go in there with a plan and you have to be able to think on your feet, because it doesn't always work out that way.
And you have to keep an eye on your foundation too. It's been out there and they're not building, and they're not building. Sometimes what the bees will do is they'll pull what little wax is on that foundation and repurpose it someplace else, and then they're not going to draw out those frames. So you find you've got foundation in there and they're not drawing. Pull it out, melt some wax, roll a little bit of wax on with a little paint roller, put it back in, and you probably see them start to build that out. But sometimes people are just like, why are they never? This has been in here for 3-4 months. Well, it probably has no wax.
I don't know if
you
you watched David Burns' videos. He did a really interesting little experiment a couple of weeks ago where he put some dyed wax, painted his honey super with some dyed wax, and some frames left undrawn, and the extra wax frame foundation wasn't drawn at all, and the dyed wax, you had orange, purple combs or reddish combs with the red dye that he'd put in it. And so colonies that were ready to build, if the wax was already there, they built it really quickly, but they didn't build on the ones that had less wax on them. So that wax on that foundation makes an enormous difference. The more the better, as long as it's still got the ridges of the honeycomb hexagonal pattern on it.
Yeah, and I've heard from other commercial beekeepers. They're like, we want to put the wax on there as late as possible, as long as it's convenient for planting, because getting that fresh stuff on there is like, we want to wax the frame, send it right into the hive, and that's the perfect time for them to draw it.
I think that's absolutely right. I made the mistake of I had a helper, so I got her to put the wax on in the fall, but it works so much better if you put the wax on in the spring, because it's still sort of tacky. And when it's soft and malleable, just like the wax they produce, they build on it more beautifully, more quickly. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yep. Got a comment here. I can smell my hives a mile away when the girls are bringing in goldenrod. See, I've never smelled it, but you guys,
Oh yeah.
You haven't had a goldenrod honey flow yet, then?
Really?
Because it's like a hamper of dirty socks.
Dirty socks.
You can smell it well before you get to the yard. Especially late in the afternoon, evenings. Sometimes you're working your bees. You went, what is that smell? And then it dawns on you what that is.
It almost has a sour, it's the strangest smell. But you can definitely, you walk by, you're like, oh, there it is. Goldenrod's out.
Yeah.
So,
and you'll really smell it in the evening when you've got a good goldenrod flow on.
Yeah. I guess I'm just getting asters,
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was weird because some of my comb was golden from last fall. So you'd think it's goldenrod, but maybe they just have the pollen in the hive, and so that transfers.
Yeah, those bees are
Yeah.
covered in yellow pollen at that time. Everything in the
Yeah.
hive is yellow,
Yeah.
but it's pollen that they got. But I've seen them on goldenrod collecting both nectar and pollen at the same time. So,
Yeah.
but the really good goldenrod flows, you can smell it very significantly.
Yeah. Yeah. I hopefully I'll get that smell. We got DC. He's commenting about the wax here. They steal the wax right off. Yeah. Especially if you're into that dearth. I'm sure you guys have experienced, if anybody's used any wax foundation, it's easier to tell because they literally just rip a lot of it out of the frames, out of the wires, and repurpose it elsewhere. And you can see it more if you look more closely on the plastic frames too.
Yeah. Yeah. And then once they've taken that wax off, then they don't want to build on the foundation, whether it's plastic or wax. They've smoothed down the edges and things. So yeah, it's definitely worth remelting down some wax and going out there a little paint roller.
Absolutely. Got DC here. Aster also smells that way. Mine got some aster the first season. Yeah, I don't know. It probably also depends on their location. There's a beekeeper. He said he was beekeeper in Oregon, and then he moved to Georgia. He said the blackberries in Georgia and the blackberries in Oregon produce completely different types, like colors of honey, even though you'd think it's probably the same plant, but maybe it's a different variety. So I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit. I thought I had fallow brood when I smelled it for the first time.
Yes, you think something's wrong at first.
Yeah.
Same you kind of appreciate it, do you?
Yeah.
Yep. Question here. I'm in my first 3 months of beekeeping. I picked up some used hives and frames. I'm wondering how to tell if a frame is too old and needs cleaning off.
I'd say on the whole, about 5 to 6 years is about the typical life expectancy of a comb before it's probably a good idea to start with a new, this is brood combs, that is.
Yeah.
Because every time a pupa develops in there, a capped brood develops in there, it leaves its pupal skin behind. And so gradually those cell walls get thicker and thicker and thicker, and you're literally producing smaller and smaller bees. And not to mention things that gradually accumulate over time, various, especially if you use anything like antibiotics or mite treatments that leave residues, like the synthetic ones. So probably 5 years is a good time to cull out brood combs. Honey supers, on the other hand, you could probably go for decades, because if they're not rearing brood in there, the combs usually stay in very good shape as long as they're being used every year. If they're not being used every year, they get pretty brittle and a lot of damage can happen.
One of the things that we tell our members too is, if you do use used hives or used equipment, it's always a good idea to maybe reach out to the state apiarist and have her come and inspect the equipment too, because some of these diseases can linger in these boxes for decades and can be fatal to hives. So it's always a good idea, if you don't know where this came from, or like Peter tells people, if it's been sitting in grandpa's barn for 10 years, get it inspected just to be safe. And and Jen is excellent about coming in and taking a look at that equipment as well. And also on your frames, I've noticed too, is the older the frames get, you'll notice that you start to lose that hexagonal shape if it's starting to look more round.
Or you got lots of drone brood on it, or something
lots
like
of drone
that.
brood on it. That's usually about time maybe start swapping it out.
Yeah. So I typically will do is move any combs that I'm looking to get rid of next year to the outside, so that they fill with honey first, and preferably down in the bottom brood chamber, because when it comes to the spring and I'm looking at rotating, reversing the brood chambers, I reverse it and I've got empty frames there now with no more honey in them. Take those out, replace them with foundation, and it's a good cycle to have. The other alternative is if you're producing nucs, you probably don't have brood combs that are more than a couple of years old anyway, because you're continuously turning over all your brood combs anyway. So I'd say my average brood comb is probably 18 months old, because I've got it for not much more than a year before they're all recycled.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's I've done some rotating, and I feel like I said, it's harder to tell with foundation. I kind of like scratch my finger on it and see how much wax comes off and how flaky it is, and that's how I decide if it's undrawn. But drawn frames, it's kind of more of a judgment call, and Jen could also help you with that and suggest what you can do with each comb depending on how dark it is.
Excuse me.
See, I wouldn't. The darkness to me doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's a matter of how thick the cell walls have become. The thick cell walls and lots of drone brood. That's a sign it's time for it to go. Brood comb will go completely black within a couple of years. It's absolutely fine. But if the cell walls are getting thick, that means they've had a lot of generations of bees in there. It's probably time to start changing them over.
So the difference between the darkness and the pupil casings is they're somewhat correlated, but not entirely. Some can get really dark without being very old.
Yeah, and it depends on the wax that they've used to some extent. They typically first brood in there, it goes shaded brown. Second brood in there, it's a dark brown. Third brood in there, it's usually going almost black.
Yeah, I've noticed some frames it'll be 3 years and they'll be completely black, and other frames it'll take 5 years, and that can just because one's a honey frame and one's always had brood in it, in the middle of the box. There's a million factors, but you just figured that out with your experience and your judgment over time.
And sometimes if you're using white foundation in the brood chamber, it gives you a misleading impression of how dark the frame the super has got. You can still see through the bottom of it.
Yep. Got a question from Charles here. What are your favorite comb replacements? Are there preferred brands?
I've used all sorts of different brands. I'd say as long as it's got a good wax coating on, I've been happy with it. I know I've once upon a time had one lot of foundation came, and the hexagon was the wrong way round. So it was flat on the bottom as opposed to flat on the side. The bee still built on it. And it worked perfectly well. That's one I was disappointed with the supplier there, but they will remain unnamed. But generally, as long as there's a good coating of wax, it's worth, if you're ordering it, it's worth paying the extra $30 for 100 sheets to get the extra triple wax coated. I think Premier is the one that does it this way, but I would say at least 2 coats, if not 3, if you can get it. It's really the biggest thing, and especially like if they're using high quality wax, you can often, when you pick up the frames, you can smell the wax. Smell the beeswax. Sometimes you smell it and it's darn well that's not beeswax I'm smelling. It still works, but I'd rather them use beeswax.
Absolutely. Got another question from Charles here. Drone comb is larger, holes correctly. The bees won't use that for honey storage. They do, Charles.
Yeah, they will. Yeah. In fact, that's their fastest way of. If you've ever got holes in your honey supers, if you break a honey super, they always fill it with drone cells because it uses less wax, so it's fast, and so it's more efficient for them. But most certainly they'll store honey in that.
Thought we'd hit on one of the topics before we close out here. So what everybody always ends up talking about, but isn't the most fun topic. So for you guys, what have you found over the years to be the most important kind of like idea or concept when it comes to managing mites with your honeybees?
It's probably the most important lesson in beekeeping. Control the mites. Your bees do a great job of everything else. You can ignore so much of the rest, but mites you cannot. I found sampling is the key, but so many people don't sample because they're afraid of killing the bees, and I understand that. It's something I wish more people would get over, but it's a fact of life. So in the absence of that, I would assume it's typical that you will need to treat several times per year. If you're treating in the summer, I'm looking forward to this new Varoxan coming out, which is the slow release oxalic acid treatment. Very much looking forward to trying that. Assuming that's not available, I would use something like Formic Pro in July, and I'm earing towards doing it early July rather than late July now. Do use it again around first week of September. And then oxalic acid 2 or 2 or maybe 3 times in the fall to mop up the mites, because mites can come into the hive in so many ways that people don't really expect them to come in. we always think of mites coming in by organic growth. They reproduce roughly every 3 weeks, roughly doubling the number of mites in the hive. But the mites are coming into the hive in a lot of different ways. In the fall, when the population is going down, the bees are drones are starting to get kicked out of the hive. Drones carry a higher proportion of mites than worker bees do. The first hives to kick out drones are the ones that are the struggling ones.
Right.
So those drones, and those are the ones that are usually struggling because they got mites, they get kicked out, but drones are usually welcome in any hive. And so they will drift into the stronger hives because normally drones are free to move. They're not a threat to anybody.
Yep.
Then those sickly hives are also starting to die from mite overload. And bees drift out of those hives incredibly quickly, as well as drifting and dying. They're drifting and abandoning ship. And so they drift, and Jen Lund has often used this example where marked hives, bees in the hives that were dying from mite overload are found for a 5-mile radius in every hive in the vicinity. And so mites are coming in that way. And thirdly, our nice healthy hive that we've just treated for mites is robbing from anyone and everyone that it can find honey. And the easy targets are the ones where mites are dying from mite overload. And so they're bringing in mites that way as well. And so that's where our assumption that we've treated for mites, it's done, it's fixed, falls flat, because they can sneak up on you, especially if you've got other colonies in the area. And that might be colonies in wild trees from the swarms that you lost that year, or it could be the neighbor down the road who believes in mite-free, chemical-free treatments, and
or not treating
at all, that sort of thing. And so we've got mite bombs all over the place that are out of our control. And so you have to keep working on the assumption that you're going to need to keep treating in the fall. So basically, if they can fly, if they can fly and rob, if it's warm enough to rob, it's warm enough for mites to get in your hive in all these extra ways as well.
And the misconception, especially with new beekeepers, are I didn't see any mites on my bees.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm good. And it's just like,
that's where your hair gets pulled out.
You're not, you know, if you do see mites on your bees, they're probably on their way out anyway. So I mean, that's, you know, it's that misconception. So I mean, it's, if nothing else, and what we try to teach our members in Beekeeping 24/7, if nothing else, going into the fall with a low mite count is key to winter survival.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I actually heard one of the people that before I started mentoring her, she's like, yeah, I treated for mites the first year, and then I didn't see any the second year, so I didn't treat for mites, and then my bees died. And you know, that's a common story. Yeah. Over and over and over.
As did your neighbor's bees who
Yep. There was one more question. I know a little bit about this, but can you talk about the Viroxan, the new extended release oxalic that's about to be approved?
Yes, we hope so. Jen says it'll be approved as soon as they get the application in. It's basically, there's been a lot of talk about folks like Randy Oliver and others who have come up with ways of introducing oxalic acid in a slow release, like in a shop towels, as well as Swedish sponges and various varieties of apparatus, which would hold the oxalic acid, and then gradually, as the bees are chewing it away and taking it out of the hive, they're spreading oxalic acid around the hive, and in some way that's killing the mites off. And so the work on that is inferred that mite levels can be kept low. It's not terrific at knocking mite levels down, but it's good at stopping them building up, which is key. And if we can keep those levels low right up to the point where we're producing bees for the winter, and then maybe do a knockdown with another treatment later in the fall, that is the key, because a lot of us find that our mites do get high unless we're keeping right on top of sampling. And last year I found that even with sampling, and I'd done some mite treatments, for the first time I've ever found that my Formic Pro treatment didn't work very well. I found it on the occasional hive, but last year I had a good, of the hives I sampled, a good half dozen that had 15 mites in them 3 weeks after treating. And that horrified me. You found the same thing?
Yeah, exact same thing. I had several treatments of formic that just did not work. I came back and the levels were pretty much exactly the same after 2 weeks, which I'd never seen before.
I hadn't seen that before either. Although I did have more honey supers on than I would normally have. How many did you have honey supers on the hives at the time?
I had a fair amount, but I
Mhm.
have in past years too.
Right. Yeah, and I have as well. But and so last year was one of those years, and it didn't happen in every yard, although that example happened
Same
in
thing.
several different yards. I had 3 different yards where I found it. But only one of those yards did I get bad survivorship over the winter, but I think there were other issues in that yard
Mhm.
as well, in terms of neighboring situations and robbing and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I hopefully that won't be the case this year, but I'd love to have another string to the bow because Formic Pro is one that we could rely on in the past.
Mhm.
And I've once in a while found the odd one not working, but this time it was
Right.
a significant percentage, which was
Yeah.
very disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah. It was so weird because I was like, man, I'm going to lose this whole yard. I treated them. I ended up getting them with Apivar after I pulled honey, but I was like, I still think it's going to be too late. I just don't. I didn't have a lot of hope for that yard, and um, it was still only. I think I was 5 for 7, but there was some kind of weird extenuating circumstances with the 2 others. But I was like, couldn't believe that they made it through winter.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm so glad you guys were able to come on tonight. It's awesome having you guys on here, and I think we had a really good chat. So
Yeah.
I wanted to
My
ask you
pleasure.
guys, yeah, thank you. Where can people find you, and is there anything else you want to say before we head off here?
Sure. You can find this a stepping stone might be my Facebook page, The Bee Whisperer. You can also find we do a lot of videos together on my YouTube channel, Beekeeping with the Bee Whisperer, as you mentioned. And then our website for beekeeping247.com is got landing page there, and you can check out some of the stuff that we're up to there,
Yep.
and see if that's something of interest. It's certainly been a lot of fun, and we have workshops like a winter workshop during the winter preparation workshops and beginner workshops as well. So we often advertise on Facebook, so that's a good way. But for those that don't use Facebook, you can go straight to the website as well.
Exactly, and I put all 3 of those links in the description so people can go right down there.
Appreciate that.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you guys for coming on, and thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you all have a great night, and we're going to stay on for a moment, but see you next time, guys. Bye.